Hi, I'm Connie Fanders.
And I'm Nina McVeigh.
And today we're going to show you the basics of making a perfect binding for your quilts. So to begin with, for the binding, you will want to cut your strip of fabric 2.5 inches wide, and then I press it in half, and my binding is ready to put on my quilt. The next step is to determine the seam allowance that is appropriate for the width of our binding. So on my first sample, I did 1/4 inch seam allowance to test it, and as I fold the binding over, you can quickly see that it is too much of the binding showing on the back as opposed to what we have on front. So the 1/4 inch isn't a wide enough seam allowance.
And then on this one, I can tell right away you were taking a wider seam allowance, but as I bring this around, it doesn't even touch that seam. And so if I do this, it would be rolling the seam if I brought this down to the seam.
That's right. Now on the last sample, I was using my walking foot, and I moved my needle position to the far right position. As I stitched, I guided the edge of my foot on the edge of the fabric. And so now, as I fold this binding to the back, you will see it is the exact same width on the back as it is the front.
And it's filled. It's the perfect binding.
It is perfect. And now all I would do is hand sew the back of the binding onto the back of the quilt, and it's done. So now that we know what our seam allowance should be, let's talk about how to make a mitered corner.
Oh, that's a good point.
To begin, I placed my binding on the top of my quilt, and I started to sew down the seam. Then the big question comes in, when do I stop? How do I know how to stop to get that nice corner? The best way to do it is to take your binding, and you're going to fold a 45-degree angle, and you can just finger press that in there. And you will know if you have a 45-degree angle if this runs perfectly straight, which it does. So by doing this, I have pressed in a crease, so then I know to stop when my needle hits that crease.
So you would press in your miter before you get to the corner so you know where to stop.
Correct. So then you go to that point and you do a tiny back stitch, and then the next step is to, again, fold it back over here. Then we're going to flip our binding piece over, lining the fold to this edge of the quilt and keeping this right even there. Now if you fold this back, again, you can make another crease here. And what's that going to give you?
Well, obviously it's going to give you the needle point of where to start.
Exactly. And so that's where we will begin to start to sew, and then we will continue on down. So I'm going to take a few stitches forward, do a quick little back stitch, and then I stitch going forward. I started my needle right in that fold, and I'm guiding the edge of my fabric right on the edge of my foot. And now it's time to flip our binding and make our nice mitered corner. But when I was going to turn it, I noticed, Nina, that my seams did not match up perfectly. And so you can see I have some extra stitching here because I went back and stitched it so these two did meet right at the corner, because that is a very important step in turning this nice mitered corner. So now I'm going to bring the binding from the front side to the back side. And so we would bring it over, and we would be hand stitching this down as we go. And as I get to my corner, we're going to flatten it as such. And then I can simply fold this over, and I have this perfect mitered corner.
It looks great.
So it looks great on the back side, and it looks great on the front.
And it's not difficult to do. It's just knowing how to do it.
That's right, and having the right tools to do it. Using the walking foot when you're putting your binding on keeps all of these layers moving together very evenly, so you don't have any shifting as you're putting that binding on. And then it also, by making sure we had the right seam allowance, it will give us that perfect binding every single time. To learn more about making perfect bindings using the Bernina walking foot, visit your local Bernina dealer today.